think so. I think we're live. So hello and welcome everyone to this special edition of Mereba Esset Conversations. Today I have Davison of International Crisis Group. We will talk about the latest report that they have issued. But before I go on to asking questions, if you're watching on YouTube, please do subscribe, share, and like the channel. We're trying to create a community, and if you do that, that would help us a great deal. So please do that. In terms of this conversation, I'll try to kind of forward questions to William perhaps for the first 30, 40 minutes, and then I will try to take questions also from viewers on YouTube if I get the technical aspects right. So just bear with me as I try to make sure that I have a channel in front of me. All right, just make sure that I could see the questions. Right. Okay, so yes, we're set to go. So welcome and thanks for the time, William.
Good morning, Teklay, and always a pleasure to chat with you, so no problem.
All right. So we'll focus on the latest report that you have issued, titled "A Rare Chance for Peace in Ethiopia." We talk about how the latest developments on the part of the Tigrayans withdrawing and retreating from Afar and Amhara, and following that, the federal government announcing that it would also not enter into Tigray, and how that has opened a chance and how it should be kind of brought by the international community, by the Tigrayans, by the Ethiopian government as well. So, and you make some recommendations on what needs to be done. But before I go into the details, William, why don't you kind of summarize the main points that you make in that report?
Yeah, not too much to add to what you just said in terms of the sort of situation that we were responding to, and I think that we saw it partly as a significant moment, not just because of the federal response. And we should note, of course, that was after reports of the ENDF and Amhara forces occupying, re-entering southern Tigray, taking back Alamata, and they said that they were on the way to Korem. There still seems to be a sort of typical amount of murkiness about that situation, but we should note that this was not stopping at the borders of Tigray as we know it, and indeed there were clear indications from federal officials, notably Redwan, that southern Tigray, that part of southern Tigray, Raya as it's known, is not considered part of Tigray essentially by the federal government. But I think we were looking at the position by the Tigray government, notably the statement, the letter by Debretsion to the UN Secretary General, and I think significantly in there. There was talk of the issue of Western Tigray, where, of course, Tigray wants that to return to Tigray administration, and that therefore all opposing forces to leave the region. There was talk of that being ensured, I believe was the phrase, by a mechanism of the UN. So therefore, that seemed like a shift in stance, in that it was no longer listed as a sort of precondition for some form of negotiation, ceasefire, peace process, and therefore, that potentially presents a different way of dealing with one of the most thorny obstacles to peace here. I think that was why we felt the need to put out this statement. I think on top of that, it was a bunch of fairly standard prescriptions from us. Talking about the need for both sides to make concessions, and obviously it looked like the Tigrayan side had made a concession already with that position on Western Tigray shifting a little bit, and then talk of the need for a political amnesty, dialogue, a detailed ceasefire, and then also I think again, to explain the sort of motivations for this type of statement, and it was just a very brief kind of update statement. That was that because of the time of year, it being Christmas time, there's a danger that the international actors that have been relatively engaged in the process, that they're essentially asleep on the job here. So partly what I wanted to do with the statement, and I actually had to prod my bosses a little bit to get this statement out, was to say to people, look, yes, there's many obstacles. We don't know exactly what's going on the ground, but this does look relatively like an important opportunity to try and press home those diplomatic efforts that you've been engaged in, and hence the appeal to the various actors, the AU envoy, US, EU, and the UN. So I think that's about the size of it, Teklay. It was a pretty simple statement, pretty short, just an update, really.
Yeah, thank you, William. I think we will return to the thorny issue of Western Tigray, and I believe that the bulk of this conversation will revolve around that. But before I go into the issue of Western Tigray, I thought I would ask you kind of a general question that I think is very important, both to the International Crisis Group, to you and other international bodies who have been trying to kind of play a role in Ethiopia. And it's a problem that I believe has afflicted all international bodies in terms of how they see Abiy Ahmed. So there is this pattern to kind of, whenever Abiy says something that is even remotely positive, there is a tendency to want to accept that at face value, because that is what must be done. So that when he, for instance, says he has halted operation, it doesn't matter whether that is actually true or not. There is kind of a desire to accept that and to latch onto that and run away with that story. But when he says something beyond the pale, for instance, in one of the statements that the government issued the day before, I think a couple of days ago, where they accused the entire Tigray people of betrayal, there is kind of a tendency to pretend that that is not being said, because that is egregious thing to say. And the international community seem to kind of ignore that part. So whenever he says something that is positive, just accept that and promote that. But when things that are beyond the pale, things that are heinous are being said and done, just pretend that nothing is being done. And do you think that the International Crisis Group also is kind of a victim of that sort of assumption when it comes to Abiy Ahmed?
No, and I don't think the other actors are either. I think what you're looking at there, Teklay, is the difference between the type of information that is received and circulated internally, and then the sort of public responses you get. So I think that sort of statement, pretty shocking as it was. That certainly informs people's understanding of the situation, gives people an idea of the true positions and intentions here. But I think that condemning the government in the most sort of forceful terms that are reasonable at every possible opportunity, that is not seen as the optimal diplomatic strategy here. And I think I would certainly take on board. You know that I follow this stuff assiduously. I comment on it publicly, with varying degrees of condemnation, etc. But it certainly sort of factors into my thinking and understanding. But then, of course, when it comes to producing a crisis group statement, as you know, as we've discussed before, there's an effort to sort of be charitable, I suppose. Essentially be optimistic or idealistic. There's an attempt to speak to all sides of a conflict, so that what we're saying is not just being received by one audience. And I think that lends itself against condemnation for particular statements like that. So it isn't a judgment on whether that statement's acceptable or not. It's just whether it fits into the broader message. And so we would tend to introduce notes of realism and therefore caution. We would talk about the obstacles that exist to the realization of our types of peaceful prescriptions, but we wouldn't necessarily focus on statements which are essentially harmful to the prospect of peace. But that isn't to say it's not noted both by ourselves and by all sorts of other international actors, and therefore feeding into people's understanding of the situation.
Indeed, yeah, I kind of understand the desire to be restrained, to make sure that you don't add fuel to the already raging fire. So I understand that, but I think the problem comes when the statements that are issued by the government, which are blatantly false again, and you would agree with me there. But when those statements inform your understanding of Ethiopia, and when you make recommendations and statements based on those statements, for instance, based on the statement that they have halted operation, when in fact, for instance, as we speak, they are fighting. I was speaking with my Tigrayan sources yesterday, and war is still raging in Western Tigray. And the federal government is, insofar as it's capable of doing, is trying to enter Tigray as far as it's able to. And why wouldn't you kind of want to understand what is actually happening on the ground, rather than what the government is saying to kind of to sugarcoat the things that they are doing on the ground? And actually, one of the senior advisors to the Prime Minister about a week ago, and I'm sure you will have seen it, said that only fools would think the government has halted the operation. What the government is actually doing it, and this is his words literally, he said that the troops, the federal troops, are kind of taking a respite to sharpen the tools so that they could cut the wood being the TPLF or Tigray people, in an effective manner. And the thing that they are doing on the ground seems to match to that, to the fact that to the extent that they had halted operation, it was to take a break and to reorganize and to replan. And my question to you, William, and not just to you, but it's because I have you here now. And this is a question that I would have asked anybody, be the US envoy, the Europeans, the African envoy. Why don't you listen to the Tigrayans, and why don't you try to understand what Abiy is trying to do on the ground, rather than rely on the statements that you know to be false again?
Well, I think part of that's answered by my previous answer, and I mean, you're referring to Daniel Kibret, right? I think the social affairs advisor of the PM, just to be clear to the audience. Yes, I mean, so my understanding, and it has been Christmas, so there doesn't seem to be that much reporting, and I've not been following as closely as usual. But I think it was mentioned to me by Getachew there was an attack from Wakimbra. There was obviously activity around Alamata and to some extent towards Korem. I heard about a TDF move towards Humera. So I do understand that there's certainly there's military operations ongoing from both sides, it seems. And I think if we try and look at the bigger picture here, Teklay, as the Tigray forces enacted this retreat, and then we saw the ENDF and Amhara forces enter southern Tigray and move towards Alamata. Of course, this raised the prospect of a repeat of November 2020, which was an absolute disaster for the Tigrayan people, also as it ended up for the federal operation, as they had to leave, eight months later. So when we talk about the positive aspects of this, and that it offers some sort of opportunity, it's because at least when there was the prospect of a full rerun of November 2020, then it seemed like there was at least some momentum on the federal side, considerable momentum, weight of opinion on the federal side, not to just go for full scale operation like November 2020. So that was something to be appreciated. Of course, the fact that they had gone into southern Tigray and the fact that these other fronts that are live suggest that this is, like you say, not really any sort of pause, or it's a very brief pause with full-scale hostilities likely to resume soon. And of course, we're not discounting that at all. And then I think the other thing to look, I noticed a quote from Sophia Tesfamariam, Eritrea's representative in New York. We saw the Azema statement. We saw Daniel Kibret's usual type of contribution. And then we saw the statement from Amhara government, as well as the betrayal comment from the federal government, including the PM. And well, these are all signs that there isn't that much, on that side of things, on the federal Eritrea Amhara side, that there's plenty of voices arguing for a continuation of the war here. I commented on Twitter this whole disarm the TPLF thing. We want peace. Hashtag disarm the TPLF. Completely disingenuous. The operation to remove Tigray's government, the TPLF, from power in November 2020 was in part an effort to disarm the TPLF, disarm Tigray. So any effort to do that can't be cast seriously, sincerely, as a peace effort. That's just a continuation of war. So I'm well aware of the wrinkles here, but I think just the fact that there was a federal decision not to make all of the mistakes of November 2020, that was something that we wanted to welcome. And any pause in the fighting, any stop in the active conflict, does potentially allow the opportunity for people to kind of rethink their actions here. And again, for the international community to use what is a relatively rare opportunity to try and put some diplomatic pressure to get people to further these initial promising steps. But just because there's some initial promising steps doesn't mean there's not a ton of reason for concern, because there is.
Yeah, well, I understand your concern and your thought process as well, and why you would want to not amplify some of the statements being made by people like Daniel Kibret, because, like I said before, they are beyond the pale. And generally, I would understand why people would want to kind of ignore them.
I do use your Twitter to try and highlight these sort of particularly egregious contributions, which I think further people's understanding of some of the actual realities and intentions as well. So there's a difference there between what comes out in a crisis group statement and what I have
indeed noticed. Yeah, I have noticed that on your personal capacity, you do indeed try to.
Well, it's not really my personal capacity. It's much more my crisis group Twitter account these days.
Yeah, but I think William, I think the problem is more than some rogue elements within the regime saying outrageous things. The most outrageous thing that you could possibly hear from the Abiy regime, that is a policy of the government. Actually, that is a problem. So, for instance, when the federal army was routed out of Tigray, I think in June, when the prime minister went on TV and said that, okay, now we're going to leave the Tigray people alone and see if they will manage life on their own, he was saying that he was going to impose total blockade against Tigray. And anybody who has been following developments, who had studied Abiy, should have pointed that out. That is what he's trying to say. And if organizations like the International Crisis Group had said that, there would have been a much strong reaction to that. But nobody picked up that, because it's unbelievable, because it's hard to believe that a government or a leader would say openly that he would blockade entire people from any kind of access. I'm giving you one example and how disastrous that has been to Tigray. The failure to try to listen to what the regime is saying and to act on the statements that are being made by the regime. So it's
if I could just come in on that, Teklay. I mean, I think Crisis Group was pretty explicit. I think it was the 30th of. No, it can't have been. It might have been the 9th of July statement where we talked about essentially the new blockade strategy. So it seemed that the part of the federal kind of thinking was, well, we've left Tigray now, therefore the TPLF, the government, they wanted power back, they've got power back, but we're going to make it incredibly difficult for them to govern and to provide services, etc., for the people of Tigray. We were explicit about that in the 9th of July statement we released, and I think that the international community has been. The US, the UN, etc. They've been pretty explicit about the illegality of the restrictions on aid and the closure of vital public services as well.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think the International Crisis Group has indeed pointed that out, but in a very watered down statement.
It's quite explicit, actually.
but the kind of statement that if any leader in any other country was to make such kind of horrible and horrendous statement, the international community would be absolutely shocked. But you don't see that kind of shock when it comes to Ethiopia. It's just business as usual, and it's just a case of people being crazy. But it's not a case of people being crazy. It's people telling you what exactly they are doing against the people of Tigray. And I think the international crisis group has been playing a positive role on balance. I think I can say that. But I think there is a tendency to kind of water down the kind of atrocity and the kind of crazy things that comes out of Addis Ababa. And I think if you are going to become a part of the solution, I think you have to first kind of describe the problem as it is without any attempt to garnish it, to make it acceptable, palatable, or anything. That would be my comment.
Yeah, so just to dig in a bit. I mean, so you know, I had like you know, I think Mereba Nagash, you know, my longtime friend, having incredible amounts of respect for him, and you know, he was saying that the betrayal statement about the Tigrayan people attacking the military from behind in June, you know, he said that is a clear indication of genocidal intent. But that's simply just not the sort of area we're going to go into in terms of making those sorts of interpretations. I'm not saying that Merkeb's wrong or there isn't a conversation to be had there, but that is a particular interpretation. And although I'm not quite sure, I certainly can't remember the exact phrasing, and obviously it was in Amharic and all the rest of it. But you know, I think as I recall the PM statements back in you know, upon federal withdrawal, it was this, you know, oh well, we've been trying to do our best for the Tigrayan people. We've spent 100 billion birr, whatever they said, and essentially they've been ungrateful, and now we're going to give them some time to think about it. Now it was incredibly crass. It's insulting given, you know, what had occurred in Tigray and to the Tigrayan people. We should also understand this is something which is just being served up for a domestic audience by the PM. You know, all governments have to make out that that they're stronger than they are, etc. And indeed, obviously, we've seen similar statements from the Tigrayan political and military leadership as well, which seem primarily deserved to try and reassure a domestic audience rather than to address realities.
Yeah, but I have seen that exchange, and I think Merkel was taking exception to the fact that you weren't really quite quoting the government exactly how it made the statement.
I did quote them exactly. I mean, I didn't quote them exactly because it's a paraphrase, right? So by definition, I didn't quote them exactly. But what I would say is I think that Merkeb and a couple of others were right that was a rather sanitized paraphrase. I just wanted to state the fact that the government had said that the Tigrayan people were responsible for attacks on the military, but I can understand that it was also an important part of the statement to talk about the fact that the government said it was an attack from behind and that indeed it was a quote-unquote betrayal.
Yeah, well, I think we'll try to have Merkeb on and have you debate about the specific point. But a related point when it comes to the international crisis group is so Abiy and the Ethiopian regime has conditioned the provision of aid to Tigray on the Tigray forces withdrawing from Afar and from Amhara. And the regime has gone to great lengths to make sure that that argument is acceptable. And I think that the crisis group has kind of lent some legitimacy to that by saying, by trying to make it kind of a legitimate concern on the part of the federal government that as long as the TPLF was a terrorist organization and occupying areas in Afar and Amhara, then the government was justified in not trying its best to provide aid to Tigray. Do you see my point?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something
rather than categorically saying that no matter what the TDF is doing in Afar and Amhara, no matter what the legal designation of the TPLF is, the federal government has a responsibility and duty to provide aid to its people. And that should have been the position that the ICG should have taken.
Yeah, so I feel like we've discussed this before. I certainly discussed this with Tedros from Riot Media recently, and then plenty of other criticisms have come our way. And I think, you know, it's a matter of phrasing. I think it's a a somewhat nuanced issue. I would refer to Tzadkan's article a couple of days ago. Now what Tzadkan said is that the Tigray government considers the delivery of aid to be a non-negotiable precondition, essentially, for talks. So you could argue that there's some linkage made there by Tzadkan, a member of the Central Command. I think that the way that I've tried to explain this, and also it's good to kind of try and make these distinctions between explaining and sort of justifying. I think the way I've tried to explain it is that if the decision to launch, Operation Mothers on the 12th of July, that was partly to overcome a siege as described by Tigray's government. Now, from our perspective, therefore, if you're looking to end the fighting, you want to remove one of the reasons for the fighting or the offensive in that instance. There's two ways to remove the siege. Either Tigray's government does it. So they tried to do that by taking over the federal government. They failed for now. Or the federal government removes the blockade themselves. So it's saying the blockade is a reason for fighting. Remove it. And therefore, that increases the chances of the fighting stopping. And if people want to describe that as making something which is a matter of international humanitarian law, sort of quid pro quo, so folding it into negotiations, I understand the sensitivities. I've tried to be increasingly explicit that this is a legal obligation of the federal government. But the fact remains that it would remove one of the stated reasons from the Tigray government for their offensive. Hence, we are connecting it to the conflict. Now, in terms of the terrorist designation, yes, I understand that this is a political decision, and these sorts of sort of legal niceties can probably be skirted if people want to. As in, if Addis decides to actually restore banking services, it could probably find a way of doing that without Parliament removing the terrorist designation. But there is some sort of legal issue there, undoubtedly. The provision of federal services to a region would mean that the regional administration is involved to some degree in delivering those services. So therefore, there has to be a legal arrangement between the federal and regional government. And of course, there's no legal relationship between the federal and regional government, not since the constitutional dispute. And now we have a terrorist organization, according to the federal government, running Tigray's government. So would the federal government be involved in sort of supporting terrorism in technical legal terms if it was involved in delivering services which were to some degree being implemented by local authorities? I don't know. And I'm not saying that these types of legal issues trump the political concerns, because this is a political decision not to provide these services.
But William, before we go into, I understand the point, the argument you're making with regard to the legal intricacies of what it would mean for a federal government to support a government that has been labeled a terrorist organization. But the obstruction of aid and the cutting of services had actually started before the TPLF had been designated a terrorist organization. And even then, no international body had called out the government. No one had categorically said that the federal government is not shouldn't be doing this against people.
Well, that's not right though, Teklay. The EU, for example, suspended its budget support to the Ethiopian federal government because of the restrictions on humanitarian access to Tigray. They did that back in November 2020.
Yeah, but again, I think before even the war had started, there was already blocking of roads, there was already blocking of banking services, of internet, of other fundamental services.
COVID assistance, locust spraying planes. There was the decision to redirect federal budget.
And I think international bodies shouldn't have played kind of fast and nice with Abiy, that they should have told him this you can't do, no matter what problems, no matter what differences you might have with the TPLF. This is simply unacceptable. And to my knowledge, nobody was categorical in saying that. It was just a case of, then because he had a problem with the TPLF, so this is acceptable, but maybe you shouldn't do that. It was always kind of vacillating between different positions, rather than clearly say this is unacceptable. And to this day, there is that kind of attempt to try to justify and accept the excuses that Abiy is giving.
Yeah, and I think it goes well. I think this is just part of the sort of the murkiness that pervades Ethiopian politics to some extent. There's often a lack of clarity. You know, we didn't have clarity on exactly what levers of influence the federal government was applying on Tigray, but I agree that a bunch of them were fairly well known about and could have been taken more clearly as an indication of what sort of strategy was being pursued. But I mean, it goes even deeper than that, right? Because some of the main federal roads to Tigray through Amhara were blocked for the majority of the time since Abiy Ahmed came to power, and this added to the siege mentality. If you're okay with that phrase in Tigray, and these were blocked by various Amhara groups, and very little was said about that at all. So I think there's this whole issue of all of these factors, circumstances, policies, attitudes that led to the war and led to the disastrous situation that we see. And I absolutely agree that there wasn't enough clarity and exposure of them in the run up to the war, whether that was in the weeks or the months or the years leading up to it.
Yeah, but what interesting that you mentioned the term siege mentality. I think the problem with that term, and I know it's not your term, you just using it because it's become kind of hackneyed term now in Ethiopian, especially when describing the Tigrayans. It implies that it was some sort of kind of paranoid that the Tigray people had, when in fact there wasn't enemy. To the extent that the Tigrayans felt that sort of mentality, it was based on an objective assessment of what is happening. Eritrean troops were amassing on the border. The federal government was clearly telling them that it was going to invade. And to the extent that they felt that sort of being sieged, I think they were perfectly justified in feeling that. So it's not a paranoid, or it's not a fear that was out of place.
Just to make a parallel, it's interesting to see the blow by blow coverage of the Russian buildup on the Ukrainian border, and just think how different things would be in Ethiopia and the Horn if we had that sort of like exposure and just simply knowledge of what's actually happening in terms of military mobilization, because we had this entire Eritrean mobilization for war, and then after that the federal and Amhara mobilization. And there was just no one really knew anything about it in a particularly authoritative way. So it was all hidden. And of course, I understand your point about siege mentality. And then I think we're just into the sort of like classic polarized positioning, right? Because I know exactly what the opponents would say. They would say the polar opposite of what you're saying. They would say that there was no malintent towards Tigrayans, and the belief that Isaias or the Amhara or anyone, including Abiy, wanted to attack them was merely a figment of TPLF propaganda. Yeah, and I know I think you know which way I come down on that, but I'm just saying that's what they would say.
Yeah, I get that. Let's go to, I think that the elephant in the room, really, Western Tigray. In the report, you say that in the letter that the Tigray president has written to the UN Secretary General, he seems to have dropped the precondition that they had put on Western Tigray before, that is non-negotiable, that it should be returned to Tigray before any negotiations could be had. And I have also read the letter that the president has written to the Secretary General, and that wasn't the impression that I came up with. I don't sense that the requirement has been dropped, but you seem to be suggesting that. Why? Can you explain?
Well, if we take a precondition to mean something that has to happen before there is a peace process, and if that and that means that all opposition enemy forces leaving Western Tigray, then it seemed to be implicit in Debretzion's letter that because there would be the establishment of a UN mechanism to ensure the withdrawal of those forces, then a peace process could get underway before Western Tigray comes fully under Tigrayan administration and control.
But this is very tricky. So as far as Tigrayans are concerned, Western Tigray, and the clue in the name is non-negotiable. It's a Tigrayan territory. It has
I'm not saying it's negotiable.
Yeah.
The significance was that it didn't. The way it was presented suggested it was not a precondition to a peace process, right? So it's something that doesn't have to occur in its totality before a peace process occurs. That was what was stated in the letter.
Yeah, but I think the president kind of, he doesn't make it explicit, of course, exactly what needs to happen. The order of events that should happen is not clear from the letter. But I think that the priority of the president of Tigray is that the Tigrayans are now starving, and that drones are being rained, bombs are being rained on the people of Tigray, and this must stop. And he says that the Tigray government is more than ready to kind of cease any operation, to come to a cessation of hostilities agreement if the UN could enforce a no-fly zone and the delivery of aid, which to the president are very, very important now, given that people are being killed and dying from starvation. As to what needs to happen for actual negotiation to start with the federal government, I don't think he has dropped the condition of Western Tigray, because, like I said, the Western Tigray is non-negotiable. And my question to you, William, is and it's not just the International Crisis Group, but the entire international community use the term contested territory. What exactly does that mean? Even it's not even clear to many Tigrayans when you say contested Tigrayans, because we don't see any basis why Western Tigray should be contested, be it historically or in any other yardstick that you want to see that.
Well, I mean, I think contested just means there's a contest over it.
Yeah, but you seem to be giving it kind of legitimacy, because what happened is the federal army invaded, along with Eritreans, invaded Tigray on the 4th of November, and then the Amhara forces illegally annexed and occupied it.
Well, I mean, it's Teklay. It was contested now, right? Because Amhara controls it, but Tigray wants it back under its administration.
Yeah, but my question.
When I wrote about it last year, it was also contested. You know, when the Walkite Amhara Identity Committee was established, and that entire process, which obviously there's going to be contestation about itself. You know, was the House of Federation just a TPLF-controlled body that rejected constitutional efforts to resolve this issue or have this issue addressed? That's the Amhara narrative. Then we're into the historical narratives. They're contested. Look, to say something is contested is not to justify the claim, you know. And I think when you describe something as, if you describe something as contested in these circumstances, I think you're saying that it's a significant, there's a significant degree of contestation, right? It's a politically consequential issue. I think it's hard to argue it's not a politically consequential dispute over Western Tigray. You know, that is not an assessment of the historic claims. It's not to say that because we're describing it as contested, the entire ethno-linguistic demographics as the main sort of criterion for establishing administrative areas and regional states in Ethiopia. We're not coming down with a position on that. You know, we're not saying that this census was faked by the TPLF, or we're not saying that all the Amhara historic claims are valid. We're not buying into that. We're just saying that there's a dispute over some territory.
Yeah,
and there is.
It's not so much about what you're saying, and maybe you are justified in saying it's contested. It's about what you're not saying, and you're not saying it has been illegally annexed and occupied. Why wouldn't you say that?
Well, we have said that in the past, and I think that Crisis Group was very explicit and quite early in saying that one of the ways to try and unlock the situation, try and start bringing the war to to an end, and getting things back to as they were in Tigray, would be the withdrawal of Eritrean and Amhara troops from Tigray. We talked in the most recent briefing. So these have been statements recently. We talked in the most recent briefing about ways to try and deal with this issue of Western Tigray. So we talked about the potential for an international peacekeeping force, which could create an incentive, as we saw it, for the Amhara forces to leave. So that's trying to sort of split the balance between the positions. But I think implicit in that is that it would return to its pre-war status. It would return to Tigray administration. And then if it wasn't to become a theater of instability for years and possibly decades to come, then there would have to be some sort of political resolution to the issue. So we have been pretty clear that this was taken over unconstitutionally during the first months of the war. But given the circumstances we have now, so if you take our positioning a little while ago, we were focused on the potential for the war coming to Addis, and therefore the pressing need for the federal government to make the concessions and to abide by its international obligations, to remove some of the reasons for that offensive. And now the circumstances have changed. Debretzion's talking about UN mechanisms to enforce the withdrawal of Eritrea and Amhara forces, and so we're responding to that position of the parties and our understanding of the situation on the ground.
Yeah, but I think Debrecen was kind of making demands about what the UN should do now to solve the kind of impending crisis in terms of hunger and in terms of the drones. I don't think he was referring to what the UN should do regarding Western Tigray to bring about a lasting solution. I don't think Debrecen would be under the impression that Western Tigray is up for negotiation or anything of that sort.
No, but what he said is that the removal of the forces was not going to occur at the hands of the TDF in advance of an internationally monitored peace process. He said it would occur as part of an internationally monitored peace process. Like that's what we were talking about. I'm not saying that the Tigrayans, the Tigray government, etc. I'm not saying are they suddenly given up on Western Tigray? They're handing it out the Amhara. I'm not saying that at all. Just pointing to the fact, as I just stated.
That is the how that it has to occur. I don't think there is any doubt that Eritrean and Amhara forces must withdraw and leave Western Tigray to Tigray. I don't think there is any doubt in Debrecen or in any Tigrayans' mind.
I agree. When I spoke to Tadkan after that briefing that I just referred to, this ideas about international forces, he totally dismissed it. He just said you don't get it, and all the rest of it. So I do understand that the Tigray government, the TPLF, the broader Tigrayan position on this issue, which is that it's not acceptable, and of course that's the crux of the problem, right? Because we have similarly firmly held positions on the Amhara side.
Yeah, but the sense of disbelief and anger and incredulity on the part of Tigrayans when the international bodies like ICG call Western Tigray contested comes from the fact that there is absolutely no basis to kind of call it contested, in the sense that there is no historical basis or any other basis for Western Tigray to even be kind of disputed land. So for instance, when people refer to some territories in other areas as contested, in Gaza, for instance, or in other countries as contested, at least we understand why the term contested is being used, right? Because there is some historical kind of contestation and competition to be had. But in the case of Western Tigray, absolutely there is no argument that you could put in favor of Western Tigray being in any other region or country other than Tigray. And I think...
Okay. But Teklay, okay. So let's just
let me make my point.
Okay.
Let me make my point so that it's clear. Yeah. So, and I think the difference, for instance, when the Tigray forces made some incursions into Afar and into Amhara, there was a consensus on the part of the international community that they must withdraw, that they shouldn't be there for anything to begin, for negotiation or for aid or for anything to begin in Ethiopia, for peace to come. The first thing that needed to happen was for Tigrayans to withdraw. And absolutely anybody was kind of convinced in making that call. But there is no that kind of conviction in demanding that the Amhara forces and Eritrean forces must withdraw from Western Tigray as well for peace to happen in Ethiopia. And my question simply, and I'm sure many Tigrayans will be kind of itching now for me to ask you that question would be, why the double standard in that?
Well, okay. So on this issue of just the name Western Tigray, right? So like you're criticizing me because for using the term contested, right? But just try and like think about like the difficulties of sort of taking any sort of like whatever like mediating partisan's not a helpful word, but non-partisan position here, because whenever I refer to Western Tigray, then I get all sorts of criticism from typically from Amhara activists. They will say that that's buying into TPLF propaganda, essentially, to say that this is Western Tigray. And I think this matter of the historical record, Teklay, to be honest, I feel like the Amhara activists and historians have done a much better job than the Tigrayan activists and historians of making claims about the fact that this area or parts of it were administered as part of historic provinces that then became predominantly part of Amhara, right? So this idea that there's no historical claim to be dealt with just seems to be burying your head in the sand, quite frankly.
Hang
on, Teklay, you have to let me finish now. But obviously, I understand that the federal system, as it's devised, parts of Afar used to be Tigray, parts of Gambela used to be Wolaga, Hararge used to Somali. Obviously, I understand that the way the federal system is organized is not based upon some concept of historic ownership. But if we are talking about which areas were administered by which historic provinces, I don't think you can just dismiss the Amhara argument. You have to contest it. And maybe that would be something which would be appropriate for one of your discussions. Like, could we organize a symposium where we talk about the history of this area, which is complicated? I read a quite interesting academic paper talking about it as a sort of frontier territory, which has switched hands back and forth. And then there's the issue of the demographics and how did the demographic change in the 80s and the 90s. These are absolutely all like interesting and important areas to delve into, but I don't think you can just like dismiss the claims in this way. But I can answer your question more directly now as well.
All right, I get your point, but I will make my point and then go to my next question.
I didn't answer that one. Yeah.
Oh, please go ahead.
Well, I think that it's because of this. I think it's because it's been such a an important point in the build up to the war, and the pretty rapid deterioration of relations between the Amhara and Tigrayan political communities. Amhara nationalism, the Walkait and Raya, that has been a focus of this ascendant Amhara nationalism, which obviously a factor in this war. I think that's why it's taken. I think that's why the language of dispute and contestation is used, because there is a real political issue at the heart of this incredibly problematic situation. I mean, the Human Rights Commission, Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, said 600,000 Tigrayans have left the area. The UN recently said 1.2 million. We've had Mike Hadro. We've got the terrible situation in Humera, the threat of more violence. So it's a massive point of, it's a massive part of the political dispute that lies at the heart of this war. And I think, therefore, trying to work out kind of short-term fixes, long-term processes, like I was talking about, some sort of symposium between communities and experts. These are the sorts of things that are needed to resolve it. And that's why I think it gets this sort of like slightly nuanced, sort of varied treatment from the international community. And then I think in terms of the why the double standards? Well, because quite simply, the Tigray forces went into Amhara and Afar to maybe stake correspondent, to to take territory, which they could then hopefully use as a point of leverage, maybe in negotiations. But they also went into that territory to try and achieve military objectives. I guess partly just to weaken the ENDF and allied forces, also trying to get to the Djibouti road, trying to get to Addis Ababa, etc., etc. And so it's quite a different situation because it's not built upon the sort of political claim that's driven the Amhara taking over Western Tigray.
Yes. So to clarify some of the points I made with regard to Western Tigray having never been in Amhara historically.
Okay.
I don't mean that some, I think I could describe them as irredentist Amhara historians haven't written history books ascribing the entirety of Western Tigray.
Acham Yele recently, and
people like him who I don't think would mind even claiming places as deep as Aksum belong to Amhara. They have been taken by the Tigrayans. That's what they believe. I didn't mean that history books haven't been written about Western Tigray being in Amhara. But when I said it doesn't have any historical basis, I meant there was no time in history where Western Tigray was administered under Amhara region. That's what I meant when I say there is no historical basis. And actually, it wouldn't make sense on the face of it. The Amhara region as a region was constituted in 1991. It didn't exist before. So it wouldn't even make sense to say that Western Tigray belongs to Amhara, because from 1991, based on the ethno-linguistic arrangement that the EPRDF kind of instituted in Ethiopia, Western Tigray belongs to Tigray. And the reason that it was kind of demarcated inside Tigray was because the people, the vast majority of people in Western Tigray, and I think the last census before the EPRDF came to power was done in 1989 or thereabouts by the DEG, who you can't accuse of being sympathetic to Tigrayans. And even according to census conducted by the DEG regime, more than, I think, 90% of the inhabitants of Western Tigray spoke Tigrinya, and that tells you that Western Tigray has always been in Tigray. So that is what I meant when I say historically it has always belonged to Tigray, and the arguments are basically the one I said. But I get your point in terms of the Tigrayans not being absolutely clear in making the case, in the argument, in presenting the historical evidence and all that. I think much could be done, and I think that's the challenge to Tigrayan historians, to make the case kind of clear in a way that people who aren't really who don't have the ins and outs of the intricacies of Ethiopia could understand it. I'm not implying that you don't understand. I think you do understand it, but generally the argument could be made much clearer in that sense. That is what I meant. But,
yeah, I mean, I think there was the 94. There was a 94 census. Then there was the sort of 1983, like Derg study of the nationalities or something. But the record doesn't seem to be very good on that. I can't remember anything from the late 80s. But anyway, like I think that the demographic assessments that were done during that period did show like a very strong predominance of Tigrinya speakers. But of course, we should note that the Amhara activist claims, Acham Yele, these types of people, they go back centuries. We're not just going back into the Derg. We're going back into the
Indeed, I mean,
we're going back a millennia, according to some people.
The claim and arguments should be considered, and they should be challenged. Of course, I don't have any problem with that. But the charge remains that you, when I say you, I don't mean you, William, but the international community generally has been lending some legitimacy to them simply because they have been they have had the temerity to make some outrageous claims, when in fact what should have happened is they should have been called out and told the truth. I think that is the charge. Why wouldn't you, for instance, why don't you openly and officially call it an illegal occupation and annexation when that is what has happened indeed?
Well, I think we have basically we've certainly used language like that in like pretty similar language to that in the past. I think making clear that that in any kind of territorial dispute, interregional territorial dispute, that there's a constitutional process for that, and that this was indeed a forceful, unconstitutional annexation of territory. So we have used that sort of language. I think, like I said before, we in this recent statement, we're responding to the shift in Tigray position, having the forces removed as a matter of a UN mechanism. But I don't think there's any lack of clarity on our part that this was an unconstitutional alteration in regional boundaries.
All right, I'm trying to read the questions from our YouTube viewers. There are many of them. So, for instance, I think this is a question that I have asked you, but one of our viewers is saying, why is Crisis Group and William consistently pushing for the legitimization of the annexation of Western Tigray? And I think you could see where they're coming from.
Mm. No, we're not. I mean, we're not. We're saying that there's short-term measures to be taken to try and stop active fighting, and then there seems to be a potential for a long-term violence. This to be a theatre of violence and a cause of violence if there isn't some political efforts to address the grievances, and the efforts to dismiss the grievances on the Amhara side and simply use force to resolve the matter will lead, we think, to a continuation of violence in the area.
Yeah. And again, on the topic of Western Tigray, there is kind of a hypothetical question. If you just establish a committee to reclaim the UK, would you just say the UK is a contested territory, just like that? So that's kind of a hypothetical.
Well, I guess there's a bunch of people who have claims on the UK, right? There's the Celts, the Vikings, the Romans.
But you wouldn't accept their claim.
It would be complicated to establish who would vote in a referendum, just like it would be in Western Tigray.
Yeah, but I think that the point would be that if the Germans were to go to the UK and claim that a chunk of land belongs to them, you wouldn't all of a sudden start saying that is a contested area. You would say that is a crazy, preposterous thing to say. That's what we would say.
Sure. I mean, I think the point is that in the Ethiopian federal system, that there are constitutional mechanisms for adjudicating on interregional territorial disputes, and I think that's what a crisis group, we believe, should happen if people have a grievance on this piece of territory or any other.
And the other question, I think we're about to run out of time, but the other question that actually the International Crisis Group has been arguing, the Ethiopian regime would have a legal obstacle in providing services to Tigray because the TPLF has been designated a terrorist organization. So the claim is that you have been lending legitimacy to the Abiy regime's claim that the obstruction came from Tigray forces and that it was justified in not trying to provide aid.
It just doesn't follow. Also, we've discussed this stuff, but I mean, no, the point is that as part of a process of political reconciliation, that the federal government should remove the terrorist designation from Tigray's ruling party, the TPLF. That would be an important part of any peace process, and that if there is any important legal impediments to the provision of services and establishing a legal relationship between the federal and regional governments, that would also be part of that. It isn't what your questioner said.
Yeah, I think some of the questions issues that we have discussed, but I want to make my viewers happy, so I'm reading out every question. The other question is, why is it difficult for the ICG to just call for unimpeded and unfettered access to humanitarian aid in Tigray without just associating it with any military and political development? Why don't you dissociate the demand for aid?
What does disassociate mean? Does it mean put it in a different paper? Like we have said that it's a legal obligation of the federal government to provide aid to Tigray, even whilst Tigray is a war zone. And we've said that the services should be restored as well. We've said it.
All right.
Like yes, it's in the same paper as some commentary and some recommendations about the broader political and military issues. But how could that not be the case?
And what law prohibits provision of services to an entire people because a certain party has been illegally designated a terrorist organization, and that's also related. I think the general kind of question and the general exception that people have taken here is that you have failed to call out the regime when it was using the terrorism charge as an excuse to starve people to death, and you should have kind of got into the bottom of things there and said that the regime is using an excuse to starve people, and you should have been open about
well,
that.
I think that the political decision by the parliament to designate the TPLF as a terrorist organization, I think that was a wrong move. And I just said, as part of any process of political reconciliation, it should be reversed. I think that I've made the point about establishing that legal relationship between the federal and regional governments that might provide some sort of legal impediment. But I understand that this is a political issue, and ultimately, I think probably the sad fact of the matter is here, if we get away from international humanitarian law and legal issues, probably whilst the federal government sees Tigray's government and its security forces as a threat to Ethiopia's peace and security, it's not a justification. That's just a description of the position of the federal government or of actors within it. Then they're probably quite unlikely to fully rehabilitate Tigray's government, to re-legitimize the TPLF, to restore banking services, fiscal transfers, full unrestricted aid delivery. Just as a matter of political reality, they're probably unwilling to do that because they see the Tigray Defense Forces as a threat. So I think those are the political realities that we're dealing with, and I think they're the political realities that everyone needs to deal with, as well as making these points about IHL and related issues.
Yes. So I think we should wrap up the conversation.
Teklay, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, sure.
So in your, well, just I guess in your view, sort of given where we are now, because I totally understand your sort of your skepticism about the idea that the peace process is around the corner, and therefore your criticism of people being sort of unrealistic and naive and all the rest of it about some of the noises coming from the federal government. But given where we are now, given the situation inside Tigray for the Tigrayan people, given the failures of the military efforts to take control of Addis, capture the Djibouti road, to overcome the siege, and given the fact that Tigray forces have withdrawn inside Tigray now, given the foreign backing for Abiy's government and the lack of corresponding support for Tigray's government, where are we going with this? What's your best idea for a way out of this absolutely horrific situation we're in?
Well, first, I don't think I would agree with your characterization that it was a military failure for the TDF. I think it was yesterday that the U.S. envoy, Jeffrey Feltman, gave an interview to NPR. I don't know if you have listened to it.
Actually, I haven't. No, I guess I was busy yesterday.
Well, he kind of bluntly said that the U.S. had demanded the TDF withdraw from Amhara and Afar regions, and that part of the reason why they needed to withdraw was because of that demand on the part of the U.S. because they weren't going to accept them as legitimate government. They weren't going to give them support and everything. So I don't think they have failed. I think they were more than capable of, at the very least, holding off the enemy, if not advance into Addis Ababa. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that, although I see why you would say that, because even Tzadkan has conceded that the drones were too much to defend against. But I think for me, the first thing, and it goes a long way into the solution, would be to accurately describe the problem. What is happening? What exactly is happening? What is the Tigray forces saying? What are the Tigray people demanding? What is the federal government trying to achieve? What is it saying in its statements? And what exactly is it doing on the ground? If you describe the problem, if you present the problem as it is, then I think the solution becomes easier. Now, the problem is there is a tendency to ignore what the government is trying to do and say, and to kind of, when the government says something that has a whiff of positivity, just accept it and latch onto it and advertise it. And that, I think, is only going to kind of make the problem even worse. And that is my main problem, the fact that there is some sort of hesitancy to see the problem.
And how would that help resolve the problem?
Well, don't they say that understanding the problem is 50% of, you know, solving the problem? The reason that people say that, you have to first describe what the problem is. You have to say that Western Tigray has been illegally annexed. You have to say that the reason the federal government is blocking aid is not because it's facing some difficulties from the TDF, but because it's following its other strategy to subjugate the Tigrayans from starvation. You have to say that even though it is saying it has halted operations, it is trying to enter Western Tigray, and at any rate, it is bombing them with drones anyway. So you have to say what is happening, and I think that is the beginning for any sort of solution. By skirting the problem, I don't think you could be kind of a legitimate source of solution and recommendation, and that would be my main charge against the ICG and other international bodies. Would be they don't want to see the problem. They don't want to see what Abiy is trying to do.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that, you know, in various ways, like that problem has been described. I mean, it's just a difference of interpretation and terminology, particularly on issues like, you know, genocide, for example. But the idea is that this would lead to more forceful international action.
Well, just imagine that there was a desire on the part of the international community to try to see into the darkness in Tigray what was being done in November 2020. Can't you kind of imagine how the solution would have come much sooner? But the problem was people refused to see the problem. People believed that it was a law enforcement operation. People believed that the Abiy government was trying to deliver aid. People believed that there was nothing nefarious and nothing malicious about the way the federal government was trying to do its business. People believed that Eritrean forces were not involved, and even the UN Secretary General believed Abiy when he made the crazy claim that Eritreans hadn't been involved, when in fact everybody knew at that point that Eritrea was knee deep in Tigray. And I think, for me, it's absolutely important that people kind of face the problem with all its ugly sides. And you have to first face the problem and start from there.
I think, I mean, I think I think it's been discussed by us. I think that, yeah, undoubtedly there was this slow reaction, certainly to illuminate, you know, some of the worst aspects of this war. But then, of course, we have had you know, some illumination of what's going on, and that has led to plenty of condemnation. And I understand the international response hasn't gone as far as you would have liked in terms of describing the problem or in terms of action. But, you know, I think the basic nature of the problem has been understood quite widely since January, and then I think it becomes a problem about the practicality of effective international action in these circumstances.
Yeah, yes, but you asked me what the international community, what demands should it be making. I would say, for instance, of course, the devil is in the details, but I would say that the international community should be demanding that the constitution be upheld and respected. And I think that should be the starting point, that the constitution should be respected, that there shouldn't be any rule of jungle today in Ethiopia, as is the case now. And I think the international community should also decouple the provision of aid and assistance to any military activities. And it should be clear. And if those demands have been made in a very clear and in a very unambiguous manner, I think that the solution would be much easier even now. But I think this is not for me to...
No, I mean, we could go on forever, right? But because obviously there was a constitutional dispute last year, and so I think it is unambiguous that the Amhara region's takeover of Western Tigray was unconstitutional. But then there was a constitutional debate last year about the legitimacy of a regional election running a election without federal authority, and then I think that people have been pretty categorical about the government's obligations, international legal obligations, to deliver aid even in these circumstances and during a war to a conflict zone. But I'm not saying that the people could not have been clearer in some respects, or they couldn't have made these assessments earlier. I'm not sure it completely resolves the problem. And in terms of the domestic dynamics here, I mean, I know you're talking to me as someone who represents an international entity, but in terms of the domestic side of things, what's the plan? Is it just a question of more warfare? Like, do you see the prospects for any type of peace process emerging from this situation? Or
well, I think at the very least, the international community should heed to the demands of the Tigrans, which I think is fair. I don't think it's too much to ask that they have the right to self-govern and administer in their own region. And I think the international community should have provided succor. And I would argue that even now, that is what should happen. If a lasting solution is going to come, people should take the Tigrans seriously and listen to what they are demanding. If it's some crazy, thing that they are demanding, or is it acceptable? And I think there has been a refusal to take the Tigrans seriously, to see them as some peripheral figures that should be kind of brushed aside, who are standing on the way of peace in Ethiopia. I think that kind of mentality should change. But I think we have kind of run out of time, so I will give you a chance to say your final remarks, and with that, we'll conclude today's conversation.
Thanks, Teklay. Nothing really to add. It's good to discuss, and just maybe like you to think about that idea of getting some sort of debate going on the issues surrounding Western Tigray, whether it's a sort of just a one-on-one debate, or some idea of organizing some sort of symposium. I think for an English speaking audience, some sort of very clear exposition just of the Tigrayan position on this issue, and I think it's always useful to separate out what is maybe a fairly widely held Tigrayan position from something which can be cast as a TPLF position, because obviously the argument here is that the TPLF just wanted an international border and to take over fertile land so they could pass it out to their fighters and stuff. But I think that would be an interesting issue for you to potentially explore in your conversations if you hadn't thought of doing so.
Yeah, well, I think that's an interesting challenge that you have given perhaps the grand lawyers and politicians to make the case and to debate, and perhaps to engage the Amharas in good faith in a debate. I think one of the things that has made debate nearly impossible between Tigrans and Amharas is because the trust has been completely broken, and I don't know how it could be amended. But if it could be, I think one of the things that must happen is a good faith debate about Western Tigray, and that's an interesting challenge. But also, I think one of the reasons why Tigrans haven't felt the need to debate about Western Tigray is, for us, it's obvious that Western Tigray is Tigray, and that we don't even kind of need the need to make the case. But yeah, thank you. That's an interesting suggestion that you have made. And apologies for the kind of Monday morning drilling, but perhaps that's what you needed after Christmas drilling.
It was fine and totally expected. So.
Yeah, but as always, I personally appreciate the things that you do on Ethiopia. I think you are one of the people who is trying to help in good faith. I don't think that you have any ill-intentioned political motives, as much as some people would like to kind of label that charge against you. I don't see that. I think you're trying to help, and I think I am personally grateful for that, and just carry on doing that.
Yeah, well, it goes without saying that I consider you to be acting in good faith, and I don't feel like these are attacks on the motives of myself or my institution. I think you're asking important questions about the assessments and analyses and policies and ICG's sort of institutional positioning and all the rest of it. And I think that's entirely legitimate, as indeed important for international actors like ourselves to be scrutinized and held accountable. So yeah, no, it's important conversation. I'd be happy to do it again sometime.
All right. Thanks, mate. Have a splendid day. Bye-bye.
All right. Thank you, Teklay. Bye-bye now.